December 7, 1941 began like any other Sunday morning on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. The sun rose over the Pacific Ocean, casting golden light across the waters of Pearl Harbor, where the United States Pacific Fleet lay anchored in seemingly peaceful slumber. Sailors aboard the USS Arizona prepared for a routine day of weekend liberty, many still in their bunks catching extra sleep before the 8 o'clock flag-raising ceremony. In the harbor's calm waters, 8 battleships sat moored along Battleship Row, their gray hulls reflecting the morning light. Nobody aboard these vessels, nor in the surrounding military installations, could have imagined that within hours, this tranquil Sunday would transform into the most devastating military attack on American soil, propelling the United States into the deadliest conflict in human history. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the first wave of Japanese aircraft toward Oahu that morning, departing from 6 aircraft carriers positioned 230 miles north of the island. The strike force consisted of 183 aircraft, 49 high-level bombers, 51 dive bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, and 43 fighter planes. As they approached the island through scattered clouds, Fuchida observed the harbor below, noting with satisfaction that the American fleet remained exactly where Japanese intelligence had predicted. At 7:49 in the morning, he transmitted the coded message that would echo through history. Tora, 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 Tiger, 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 signaling to the Japanese fleet that complete surprise had been achieved. The architects of this audacious assault had spent months planning every detail. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, had conceived the attack despite his own reservations about war with America. According to Gordon W. Prang's comprehensive study, At Dawn We Slept, The Untold Story of Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto believed Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States, but if conflict became inevitable, a devastating first strike might provide Japan the breathing room needed to consolidate its conquests in Southeast Asia. The admiral had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington, giving him unique insight into American industrial capacity and national character. Japanese planning began in earnest during January 1941, nearly 11 months before the attack. Captain Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant naval aviation strategists, refined the tactical approach, while Commander Mitsuo Fuchida trained the strike force relentlessly. The pilots practiced torpedo runs in Kagoshima Bay, whose depth and topography resembled Pearl Harbor. Japanese engineers modified Type 91 torpedoes with wooden fins, enabling them to operate in the harbor's shallow 45-foot waters, a technical achievement American strategists had deemed impossible, leading them to discount the threat of aerial torpedo attack. Throughout 1941, diplomatic relations between Japan and the United States deteriorated rapidly. Washington had imposed increasingly severe economic sanctions on Tokyo following Japan's invasion of China and occupation of French Indochina. The American oil embargo implemented in August 1941 proved particularly devastating. Japan imported 80% of its oil from the United States, and the embargo threatened to strangle the Japanese war machine within months. Emperor Hirohito's government faced a stark choice: abandon its imperial ambitions or seize the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia, which would inevitably mean war with America, Britain, and the Netherlands. While diplomats in Washington negotiated, the Japanese First Air Fleet, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, departed Hitokapu Bay in the remote Kuril Islands on November 26, 1941. The strike force maintained strict radio silence during its 11-day voyage across the North Pacific, taking a northern route where detection by merchant vessels or patrol aircraft seemed unlikely. Aboard the carriers, pilots studied detailed models of Pearl Harbor, memorizing targets and attack approaches. At 7:55 on that fateful Sunday morning, the first Japanese bombs fell on Wheeler Field, one of Oahu's military airfields. Sailors at Pearl Harbor, hearing distant explosions, initially mistook the sounds for routine training exercises. This confusion proved fatal. Within minutes, torpedo bombers swept low across the harbor's entrance, their deadly payload streaking toward the battleships moored along the southeastern shore of Ford Island. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata led the torpedo bomber squadron with devastating precision. His aircraft targeted the battleships from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming any possibility of coordinated defense. The USS Oklahoma, moored outboard of the USS Maryland, absorbed 3 torpedoes within the first 10 minutes. The massive vessel shuddered violently, rolled slowly to port, and within 12 minutes capsized completely, trapping over 400 sailors inside her overturned hull. Survivors described the horrifying experience of being trapped in darkness as the ship turned turtle, water rushing through compartments, men scrambling desperately upward, which had become downward, seeking air pockets. The USS West Virginia, moored outboard of the USS Tennessee, sustained 6 or 7 torpedo hits almost simultaneously. Captain Mervyn Bennion commanded the ship from the bridge when shrapnel from an exploding bomb struck him in the abdomen. Despite mortal wounds, Bennion remained at his post, issuing orders until he died in the arms of Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller. Miller, an African-American sailor assigned to collect laundry because Navy regulations barred black servicemen from combat positions, carried his dying captain to safety, then manned an unmanned .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun, firing at Japanese aircraft until ordered to abandon ship. Miller received the Navy Cross for his heroism, the first African-American so honored in World War II, though official recognition came only after considerable pressure from the black press. While torpedo bombers wreaked havoc on Battleship Row, high-level bombers attacked from 9,000 feet. These aircraft carried 16-inch armor-piercing shells converted into bombs, specifically designed to penetrate battleship deck armor. At 8:10, one of these devastating weapons struck the USS Arizona near the forward ammunition magazines. The resulting explosion ranked among the most catastrophic in naval history. A massive fireball erupted from the ship's center, lifting the forward section momentarily before it crashed back down. The blast killed Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg instantly, along with over 1,000 crewmen. The Arizona sank within 9 minutes, taking 1,177 sailors and Marines to their deaths, nearly half the total American fatalities that day. Across the harbor, dive bombers screamed down on other targets. The USS California, flagship of the Pacific Fleet's battleships, took 2 torpedoes that flooded her compartments. Damage control teams fought valiantly to save the ship, but progressive flooding eventually forced her abandonment. She settled into the harbor's mud, her superstructure remaining above water. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a magnet for Japanese aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas maneuvered the damaged vessel down the harbor channel, attempting to reach open water, but concentrated bombing forced him to beach her near Hospital Point to prevent sinking in the channel, which would have blocked harbor access for weeks. The human cost of those first terrifying minutes defied comprehension. Men burned alive in oil-slicked waters. Sailors trapped in overturned hulls hammered desperately on steel plates as rescuers worked frantically with cutting torches. Medics overwhelmed by casualties made agonizing triage decisions. Private First Class James Corey, a Marine stationed at the Naval Air Station, later described the scene. The harbor was a mass of flames. Ships were burning everywhere. Men were swimming through oil fires. The noise was deafening. Bombs exploding, anti-aircraft guns firing, men screaming. Despite the chaos, Americans fought back with whatever weapons they could reach. Sailors on the USS Maryland, protected from torpedoes by the capsized Oklahoma alongside, manned their anti-aircraft batteries throughout the attack. On Ford Island, aviation mechanics pushed undamaged aircraft away from burning hangars, preparing them for flight. Pilots who reached their planes took off amid falling bombs, some without parachutes or full ammunition loads, determined to engage the enemy. At 8:54, just as the first wave began withdrawing, Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led 170 aircraft of the second wave over Oahu. This force consisted primarily of dive bombers and high-level bombers, with fighters providing cover. Unlike the first wave, which achieved complete surprise, the second wave encountered fierce resistance. American anti-aircraft fire had intensified dramatically as shocked defenders recovered from the initial assault and manned every available gun. The second wave focused on targets missed or damaged but still functional from the first attack. The USS Pennsylvania, in dry dock at the Navy Yard, became a primary target. Though the battleship survived with relatively minor damage, the destroyers USS Cassin and USS Downs, sharing the dry dock, were devastated by bombs and subsequent fires. The intense heat caused the Cassin to roll off her blocks onto the Downs, creating a twisted mass of metal that appeared beyond salvage, though American determination would later prove otherwise. Japanese pilots also struck the fuel storage facilities and the Naval Air Station's hangars, seeking to maximize long-term damage to American capabilities. Fortunately for the Americans, the massive fuel tank farms northeast of the harbor, containing 4.5 million barrels of oil, representing months of supply, escaped serious damage. Had these tanks been destroyed, the Pacific Fleet would have been forced to operate from the American West Coast, fundamentally altering the war's early campaigns. Similarly, the submarine base and its repair facilities remained largely intact, allowing America's submarine force to operate effectively from the war's beginning. Lieutenant Commander Shimazaki's aircraft also attacked Hickam Field, Kaneohe Naval Air Station, and Bellows Field with renewed intensity. At Hickam Field, adjacent to Pearl Harbor, hangars and barracks erupted in flames. American fighters attempting to take off faced withering fire. Second Lieutenant George Whiteman managed to get his P-40 aircraft airborne at Bellows Field, but was shot down and killed within minutes. Throughout Oahu, Japanese fighters strafed parked aircraft, destroying dozens of planes lined up wingtip to wingtip, peacetime positioning that made them easy targets. The attack's fury finally subsided around 9:45, when the last Japanese aircraft departed northward. Behind them lay a scene of unprecedented devastation. According to Walter Lord's definitive account, Day of Infamy, the raid killed 2,335 American servicemen and 68 civilians. Another 1,143 were wounded. The Navy lost 2 battleships completely, the Arizona and Oklahoma. 3 others, the California, West Virginia, and Nevada, sank in shallow water. The remaining 3 battleships sustained varying degrees of damage. Additionally, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and numerous smaller vessels were damaged or destroyed. American air forces lost 188 aircraft destroyed and 159 damaged. Yet despite these staggering losses, the attack failed to achieve several crucial objectives. Most importantly, the Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, were absent from Pearl Harbor that morning, having departed on various missions. These carriers would prove decisive in the coming war. The repair facilities, oil storage tanks, and submarine base survived largely intact, enabling rapid American recovery. Furthermore, most damaged battleships sat in shallow water, allowing salvage operations that would return many to service. American sailors demonstrated extraordinary heroism throughout the attack. Chief Watertender Peter Tomich remained at his post in the USS Utah's engineering spaces, ensuring boilers were secured before the ship capsized, sacrificing his life so others could escape. Machinist Donald Ross stayed in the forward dynamo room of the USS Nevada for over 60 hours after the attack, keeping power running despite toxic smoke and heat. These men and hundreds like them received medals for valor, but thousands more performed anonymous acts of courage that went unrecorded. From the Imperial Japanese Navy's perspective, the Pearl Harbor operation represented both tactical triumph and strategic miscalculation. Commander Fuchida, leading the airstrike, reported sinking 4 battleships, damaging 4 others, and destroying numerous aircraft while losing only 29 aircraft. Vice Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, faced a crucial decision as his pilots returned to their ships. Should he launch a third wave? Commander Genda, the operation's principal tactical planner, urgently advocated for additional strikes. He argued that the fuel storage facilities, repair yards, and submarine base remained largely undamaged. Destroying these installations would force the Pacific Fleet to withdraw to the American West Coast, crippling American offensive capability for months or even years. Several other officers supported this position, pointing out that American carrier forces remained unlocated and might threaten the Japanese fleet. However, Admiral Nagumo decided against a third wave. His concerns were pragmatic. His fleet had maintained radio silence for nearly 2 weeks, and he believed continued presence near Oahu risked detection and counterattack. 2 American carriers remained unlocated, potentially lurking nearby. Japanese aircraft had sustained losses, pilots were exhausted, and surprise, the operation's greatest advantage, had been lost. The defensive fire during the second wave demonstrated that Americans would not remain passive. Weather conditions were deteriorating, and Nagumo feared losing his way home through the North Pacific in winter storms. This decision haunted Japanese strategists throughout the war. Admiral Yamamoto himself later acknowledged that failing to destroy the fuel storage and repair facilities represented a significant error. As events proved, American salvage crews raised and repaired several battleships that Japan believed permanently destroyed. The California, West Virginia, and Nevada all returned to active service, participating in later campaigns. Even the seemingly annihilated Cassin and Downs were rebuilt. Only the Arizona and Oklahoma never returned to service, and the Oklahoma's loss resulted primarily from the difficulty of righting a completely capsized vessel, not irreparable damage. Beyond tactical considerations, the attack's strategic implications rapidly became apparent to thoughtful Japanese leaders. Admiral Yamamoto famously wrote in his diary that he feared all they had accomplished was awakening a sleeping giant and filling him with terrible resolve. This prescient statement, though its exact wording remains historically debated, captured the fundamental miscalculation underlying Japanese strategy. Japan's leaders believed that a devastating initial blow would demoralize Americans, convincing them to negotiate peace that recognized Japanese dominance in East Asia. The Japanese government had intended to deliver a declaration severing diplomatic relations 30 minutes before the attack commenced, maintaining technical adherence to international law. However, the Japanese embassy in Washington experienced delays in decoding and transcribing the lengthy document. Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu presented the message to Secretary of State Cordell Hull only after news of the Pearl Harbor attack had reached Washington. Hull, already informed of the raid, read the document and responded with barely controlled fury, calling it a document of infamous falsehoods and distortions. The timing failure ensured that history would remember Pearl Harbor as a sneak attack, intensifying American anger and determination. In Washington, December 7th began quietly. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt spent Saturday evening, December 6th, working in his study with advisor Harry Hopkins. They discussed the latest diplomatic communications from Japan, which suggested negotiations were near collapse. Roosevelt remarked that conflict seemed imminent, though he hoped to avoid firing the first shot. The president retired late, unaware that Japanese carrier aircraft were already positioning for their dawn attack. News reached Washington around 1:40 in the afternoon Eastern Time, 7:50 in the morning Hawaiian Time. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox received the first report. Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is not drill. The message's brevity and shocking content initially prompted skepticism. Knox telephoned President Roosevelt immediately. The president's reaction, witnessed by Harry Hopkins, reflected both shock and grim resolution. Roosevelt made numerous phone calls through the afternoon, contacting military leaders and cabinet members, assembling information about the disaster unfolding 5,000 miles away. Secretary of State Hull received the Japanese envoys at 2:20 that afternoon, 20 minutes after the attack ended. Nomura and Kurusu remained unaware of Pearl Harbor as they presented Japan's message, which broke off negotiations but contained no declaration of war. Hull read the document, knowing its contents from decoded intercepts American intelligence had been reading for months, then looked at the Japanese diplomats with contempt. He later recorded his response in his memoirs. In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions, on a scale so huge that I never imagined until today that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them. The president spent the afternoon in his study receiving reports from Hawaii, the Philippines, and other locations. News arrived sporadically and often contradictorily. Initial casualty estimates varied wildly. Some reports suggested Japanese forces were landing on Oahu. Others claimed the attackers came from nearby islands or even from Japanese saboteurs in Hawaii. The fog of war obscured clear understanding for many hours. Roosevelt maintained remarkable composure, though intimates noted his anger beneath the surface calm. By evening, Roosevelt had decided on his response. He would address Congress the following day, requesting a declaration of war. He worked late into the night drafting his speech with Hopkins and speechwriter Samuel Rosenman. The president wrote the opening sentence in his own hand. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. This sentence, which Roosevelt revised from Hopkins's initial suggestion of a date which will live in world history, captured perfectly the shock and outrage sweeping the nation. Cabinet members convened at 8:30 that evening for an emergency meeting lasting 2 hours and 25 minutes. Secretary Knox presented available information from Pearl Harbor. Secretary of War Henry Stimson discussed the situation in the Philippines, where Japanese attacks had begun hours after Pearl Harbor. The cabinet unanimously supported war. Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, the first woman cabinet member in American history, later recalled Roosevelt's demeanor. His pride in the Navy was so terrific that he was having physical difficulty in getting out the words that put him on record as knowing that the Navy was caught unawares. The president, who had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I, took the Pacific Fleet's defeat personally. Congressional leaders arrived at the White House at 9:30 for briefing and consultation. Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Tom Connally exploded in anger upon learning details of the attack, demanding to know where the Navy had been and why defenses had failed. Roosevelt absorbed the criticism quietly, recognizing that questions about intelligence failures would require future answers. But immediate unity was essential. Both Democratic and Republican leaders pledged full support for war. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, a prominent isolationist, declared his previous position ended in the smoke of Hawaii. President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress at 12:30 on Monday, December 8, 1941. His speech, broadcast nationwide on radio, lasted 6 minutes and 30 seconds. Millions of Americans gathered around radio sets in homes, offices, and public spaces to hear their president's words. Roosevelt's voice, familiar from countless fireside chats, carried unusual gravity as he recounted the previous day's unprovoked and dastardly attack. The president methodically listed Japanese attacks throughout the Pacific during the preceding 24 hours. Beyond Pearl Harbor, Japan had struck Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Midway Island. This litany demonstrated that Pearl Harbor represented merely one component of a massive coordinated offensive across the entire Pacific region. Roosevelt concluded with his request. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. Congress responded with overwhelming support. The Senate voted 82-0 for war. The House of Representatives voted 388-1. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana cast the sole dissenting vote. A committed pacifist who had also voted against entering World War I in 1917, Rankin faced immediate condemnation. She required police escort from the Capitol building as angry crowds threatened her. Her political career ended in that moment, though she maintained throughout her long life. She died in 1973 at age 92, that her conscience required that vote. Within hours of Congress's declaration, the entire nation mobilized for war. Young men flooded military recruiting stations in numbers that overwhelmed processing capacity. In New York City, lines extended around blocks as men waited hours to enlist. Recruiting offices remained open 24 hours daily to handle the unprecedented volume. Many recruiters waived technical requirements in the rush to accept volunteers. Joseph Martinez, who attempted to enlist in Los Angeles, recalled, "The line was so long I waited 8 hours. When I finally got inside, they were accepting almost everyone. Fellows who might not have qualified last week suddenly found themselves in uniform. American industry, already producing war materials for Britain under Lend-Lease, shifted to full war production. President Roosevelt soon announced production targets that seemed fantastical. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, along with corresponding numbers of tanks, ships, and weapons. Critics called these goals impossible. Yet American industrial might, unleashed by wartime necessity, would ultimately exceed even these ambitious targets. Detroit's automobile factories retooled for tank and aircraft production. Shipyards expanded exponentially. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers as Rosie the Riveter became a national icon. The attack also unleashed darker forces in American society. Suspicion fell immediately on Japanese Americans, particularly on the West Coast, where approximately 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry lived. The Hearst newspapers and other media outlets published inflammatory articles questioning Japanese American loyalty. Lieutenant General John DeWitt, commanding the Western Defense Command, declared that the Japanese race is an enemy race, regardless of citizenship status. These prejudices, combined with wartime hysteria and long-standing West Coast racism against Asian immigrants, would culminate in one of America's gravest civil liberties violations. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing military commanders to designate areas from which any persons could be excluded. This deliberately vague language provided legal cover for mass incarceration. Within months, virtually all Japanese Americans living in California, Oregon, and Washington were forcibly removed from their homes and imprisoned in 10 desolate internment camps scattered across remote locations. They lost homes, businesses, and possessions, suffering this punishment without charges, trials, or evidence of wrongdoing. German Americans and Italian Americans faced no comparable mass detention, revealing the racial motivation underlying the policy. Despite this injustice, many Japanese American young men volunteered for military service determined to prove their loyalty. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Infantry Battalion, composed entirely of Japanese Americans, became among the most decorated units in American military history. They fought with extraordinary valor in Italy and France, sustaining casualty rates exceeding 200% as replacements for fallen comrades filled their ranks repeatedly. Their sacrifice would eventually help overturn discriminatory policies, though full recognition required decades. While America mobilized at home, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with stunning speed. The carefully coordinated offensive that began at Pearl Harbor continued throughout December 1941 and into early 1942, seizing a vast empire stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. Japanese strategic planning envisioned creating a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for America to breach, eventually forcing a negotiated peace recognizing Japanese conquests. In the Philippines, Japanese aircraft struck American airfields on Luzon mere hours after Pearl Harbor. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding United States Army forces in the Far East, received warning of Pearl Harbor approximately 5 hours before Japanese bombers appeared over Manila. Despite this advance notice, American aircraft remained on the ground, closely parked and vulnerable. The reasons for this failure remain controversial. MacArthur later claimed dense fog prevented launching aircraft, though weather records contradict this assertion. Regardless of cause, the result proved devastating. Japanese bombers destroyed half of MacArthur's air force, 18 B-17 bombers and numerous P-40 fighters in a single attack. Japanese ground forces invaded the Philippines on December 10th and 22nd, quickly overwhelming Filipino and American defenders. MacArthur withdrew his forces to the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island, where they conducted a stubborn defense. President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to Australia in March 1942, famously promising, "I shall return," as he departed. Left behind, Major General Jonathan Wainwright surrendered the remaining forces in May 1942. Approximately 75,000 Filipino and American prisoners began the infamous Bataan Death March, a 65-mile forced march during which Japanese guards brutalized prisoners. Between 5,000 and 18,000 prisoners died from execution, disease, and exhaustion during the march and subsequent captivity. Guam, a small American island possession in the western Pacific, fell to Japanese forces on December 10th after a brief defense by its small garrison. Wake Island's garrison of 450 Marines and 1,000 civilians held out until December 23rd, repelling initial invasion attempts and shooting down numerous Japanese aircraft. The defenders' heroic resistance briefly boosted American morale, but overwhelming Japanese forces eventually prevailed. Commander Winfield Cunningham surrendered after being told further resistance would result in immediate execution of civilian contractors. The Japanese shipped prisoners to camps in China, where many died in captivity. Hong Kong, defended by British, Canadian, and Indian forces, endured 17 days of fighting before surrendering on December 25, 1941. The Japanese invasion of Malaya proceeded with shocking speed. British forces, anticipating attack from the sea, had positioned defenses facing the wrong direction. Japanese troops advanced overland through supposedly impassable jungle, outflanking British positions repeatedly. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival's forces retreated steadily down the Malay Peninsula toward Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress at the peninsula's southern tip. The British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse sortied from Singapore on December 8th to attack Japanese invasion convoys. Operating without air cover, the carriers that should have accompanied them had run aground during trials. The two capital ships encountered Japanese bombers on December 10th. In a dramatic demonstration of air power's supremacy over traditional naval might, Japanese torpedo bombers sank both vessels within 2 hours. Admiral Sir Tom Phillips went down with his flagship Prince of Wales, along with 840 officers and men. The disaster shattered British naval prestige and left the Indian Ocean vulnerable to Japanese attack. The Dutch East Indies, rich in oil and rubber Japan desperately needed, became a priority target. Japanese forces invaded in January 1942, overwhelming Dutch, British, Australian, and American defenders through superior numbers and coordination. The Allied ABDA Command, American, British, Dutch, Australian, attempted to coordinate defense but collapsed amid the Japanese onslaught. In the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942, a Japanese fleet destroyed an Allied naval force, sinking 5 ships without Japanese loss. The Dutch surrendered on March 9, 1942. Even as Japanese forces conquered their empire, American efforts at Pearl Harbor demonstrated the resilience that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. Captain Homer Wallen received appointment as salvage officer for the Pacific Fleet mere days after the attack. He faced seemingly impossible challenges: battleships sunk in harbor mud, vessels capsized or burned, thousands of tons of twisted metal blocking harbor access. Many naval experts believed the damaged ships beyond recovery, recommending they be abandoned or scrapped. Wallen thought otherwise. He assembled teams of salvage specialists, Navy divers, civilian contractors, and engineers, applying innovative techniques to raise and repair the damaged vessels. The first priority involved clearing the harbor channel. The capsized Oklahoma blocked critical waterfront areas. Beginning in March 1942, salvage crews attached 21 enormous electric winches to the Oklahoma's hull, each capable of pulling on cables with 50 tons of force. Over several months, they gradually rotated the 35,000-ton hull until it righted sufficiently for pumping operations. The Oklahoma finally rose to the surface in November 1943, nearly 2 years after sinking. The USS California and USS West Virginia rested on the harbor bottom, but remained largely intact. Salvage crews sealed hundreds of shell and bomb holes, patched damaged plates, and constructed cofferdams around damaged areas. As pumps removed water, workers discovered bodies of sailors trapped when the ship sank. These grim discoveries reminded salvage crews they labored in mass graves. Both battleships eventually floated again and proceeded to West Coast shipyards for complete rebuilding. They returned to service in 1944, participating in later Pacific campaigns. The USS Nevada, deliberately beached to prevent blocking the channel, required less dramatic salvage. Temporary repairs enabled her to move under her own power to the Navy Yard in April 1942. After patching at Pearl Harbor, she sailed to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard for major reconstruction. The Nevada returned to service in May 1943 and participated in the Normandy landings, bombarding German positions at Utah Beach, before returning to the Pacific for the assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Arizona presented a different challenge. The catastrophic magazine explosion had destroyed her forward structure completely. The ship remained on the harbor bottom, her superstructure visible above water, with 1,177 men entombed within her hull. Salvage crews removed the aft turrets and other usable equipment, but the hull itself remained in place. The Navy eventually designated the Arizona as a war grave, prohibiting disturbance of the wreck. In 1962, a memorial was dedicated above the ship's hull, allowing visitors to pay respects to the fallen. Civilian workers at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard performed extraordinary work throughout the war. The yard's facilities expanded dramatically, employing over 20,000 workers by mid-1942. They repaired battle-damaged vessels returning from combat throughout the Pacific, often performing miracle repairs that returned ships to action within weeks. The submarine base facilities proved particularly valuable, servicing the submarine fleet that carried the war to Japanese home waters. American submarines sank the majority of Japan's merchant fleet, strangling the island nation's economy and military logistics. The attack's failure to destroy the Navy Yard's repair facilities and fuel storage proved decisive. Had these installations been destroyed, the Pacific Fleet would have required operating from the American West Coast, adding 3 weeks to any Pacific operation. Ships damaged in combat would have needed sailing across the Pacific for repairs, removing them from action for months. The fuel storage tanks, holding enough oil to operate the fleet for many months, enabled sustained offensive operations. Japanese strategic planning had prioritized the battleships, viewing them as the fleet's primary striking power, while underestimating the importance of support facilities. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor demanded American response. President Roosevelt urged military planners to strike Japan itself, demonstrating America's determination and reach. Army Air Force's Captain Francis Lowe suggested launching Army bombers from Navy carriers, allowing attacks on Japanese cities from sea approaches. The idea seemed fantastical. Army B-25 medium bombers had never operated from carriers, but Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle volunteered to lead the mission. 16 B-25 bombers launched from the USS Hornet on April 18, 1942, while still 668 miles from Japan, farther than planned after a Japanese patrol boat spotted the task force. The bombers struck Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya, causing modest physical damage but enormous psychological impact. Americans celebrated wildly at news of the raid. Japanese military leaders, humiliated that enemy aircraft reached their sacred capital, accelerated plans for offensive operations intended to extend Japan's defensive perimeter. The Doolittle raiders faced desperate situations after their attacks. Unable to return to the carrier, they flew toward China, hoping to reach friendly airfields. Most crews crash-landed or bailed out over China. Chinese civilians and guerrillas rescued many airmen, suffering terrible Japanese retaliation. Occupation forces killed an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians in areas that sheltered Doolittle's men. 8 raiders were captured by Japanese forces. 3 were executed, 1 died in captivity, and 4 survived imprisonment until war's end. The raid's strategic consequences exceeded its tactical results. Japanese naval commanders, stung by the attack on their homeland, determined to eliminate American carrier forces before they could strike again. Admiral Yamamoto planned an operation to seize Midway Atoll, a tiny American outpost 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. He believed American carriers would respond, enabling their destruction in decisive battle. The operation proceeded in early June 1942, precisely as Yamamoto anticipated. Except American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese plans, transforming the trap into an ambush. The Battle of Midway, fought June 4 through 7, 1942, reversed the Pacific War's momentum. American dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown caught 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, while their aircraft were refueling and rearming on their decks. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were fatally damaged. The fourth, Hiryu, was destroyed hours later. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots, and the strategic initiative. Admiral Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, later stated, "Pearl Harbor was avenged." 6 months after Pearl Harbor, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning the long, bloody offensive that would ultimately reach Japan itself. The campaign lasted 6 months, involving brutal jungle fighting and 7 major naval engagements. Both sides sustained heavy losses, but American industrial production replaced losses while Japan's shipyards and aircraft factories struggled. The pattern established at Guadalcanal, attrition favoring American material superiority, repeated throughout the Pacific War. The naval battles around Guadalcanal demonstrated how dramatically the naval balance had shifted. At Pearl Harbor, Japan had destroyed or damaged 8 American battleships. Yet in the subsequent year of Pacific combat, battleships played minimal roles. Aircraft carriers dominated operations. America's carriers, absent from Pearl Harbor, formed the core of the rebuilt Pacific Fleet. By mid-1943, new Essex-class carriers were joining the fleet at a rate Japan could not match. The industrial capacity that Japan's leaders had discounted was producing an overwhelming tide of ships, aircraft, and weapons. The Pearl Harbor attack's ultimate significance transcended its immediate military results. It transformed American society, ending the isolationist sentiment that had dominated the 1930s. A nation fractured by economic depression and political debates over foreign involvement united with remarkable speed and determination. This transformation, perhaps more than any tactical consideration, doomed Japanese strategic calculations. Admiral Yamamoto's fear that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant proved entirely accurate. The attack killed 2,335 American servicemen and 68 civilians. It wounded 1,143 more. These casualties, though modest compared to later battles, Okinawa alone cost 12,000 American deaths, shocked Americans precisely because they occurred during nominal peace, without warning or declaration of war. The sneak attack narrative became embedded in American consciousness, fueling a determination to fight until Japan's unconditional surrender. No negotiated peace would satisfy a nation that viewed Pearl Harbor as an act of treachery. President Roosevelt faced intense criticism regarding intelligence failures that allowed the attack's success. Congressional investigations began even before the war ended, seeking to assign blame for the disaster. These inquiries revealed a catalog of errors: failure to share intelligence between Army and Navy commands, underestimation of Japanese capabilities, peacetime complacency despite mounting tensions, and inadequate alert procedures. Lieutenant General Walter Short and Admiral Husband Kimmel, commanding Army and Navy forces in Hawaii respectively, were relieved of command and forced into retirement, bearing responsibility for the disaster. The question of whether Roosevelt or other senior officials possessed advance warning of the attack has generated controversy for 8 decades. Some critics alleged the president deliberately allowed the attack to provide a pretext for entering the war. However, exhaustive historical research, including examination of decoded Japanese communications, has found no evidence supporting this conspiracy theory. American intelligence had broken Japanese diplomatic codes and rid Japan's diplomatic traffic, but had not penetrated Japanese naval codes at the time of the attack. While officials anticipated Japanese aggression somewhere in the Pacific, they expected strikes against British or Dutch possessions, not an audacious attack on Pearl Harbor itself. The military lessons from Pearl Harbor reshaped American defense thinking. The vulnerability of concentrated forces became apparent: the neat rows of parked aircraft, the closely moored battleships. The supremacy of air power over traditional naval forces was demonstrated conclusively. The importance of intelligence and early warning systems proved critical. These lessons influenced American military doctrine throughout World War II and into the Cold War era. The establishment of unified commands, improved inter-service cooperation, and enhanced intelligence sharing all traced origins to Pearl Harbor's failures. For survivors, December 7, 1941 remained a defining moment of their lives. They carried memories of friends lost, ships destroyed, and their own narrow escapes. Many returned to Pearl Harbor in subsequent decades for anniversary commemorations, remembering shipmates who never left. Lauren Bruner, who escaped the burning Arizona by climbing a rope stretched to the adjacent repair ship USS Vestal, while machine gun bullets struck around him, attended memorial services for over 7 decades until his death in 2016 at age 98. His ashes were interred within the Arizona alongside his fallen crewmates, one of 43 survivors choosing burial in the ship they once served. The USS Arizona Memorial, dedicated in 1962, became America's most visited war memorial outside Washington. The white structure spans the sunken battleship's hull without touching it, allowing visitors to look down into the water where the vessel rests. Oil still leaks from the Arizona's fuel tanks, rising to the surface in iridescent droplets survivors call the tears of the Arizona. The memorial's design, by architect Alfred Price, deliberately sags in the center, but rises strongly at both ends, symbolizing initial defeat followed by ultimate victory. Japanese perspectives on Pearl Harbor evolved considerably over subsequent decades. Immediately after the attack, Japanese media celebrated a glorious victory. Government propaganda depicted samurai warriors destroying decadent Western power. As the war turned against Japan, however, and American bombers reduced Japanese cities to ruins, some began questioning whether attacking America had been wise. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the nation underwent profound reflection about the militarism that had led to catastrophe. In 1991, on the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, considerable controversy erupted over whether Japanese officials should apologize for the attack. Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa expressed deep remorse over the war, but stopped short of the explicit apology many Americans sought. Japanese conservative politicians argued their nation had already apologized sufficiently, and that continuing demands for apologies insulted Japanese dignity. American veterans responded that an attack killing over 2,000 people in peacetime deserved unambiguous apology. The debate revealed how historical grievances persist across generations. Some Japanese officers who participated in the attack later expressed regret. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the airstrike and shouted, "Tora, Tora, Tora," became a Christian missionary after the war and dedicated his life to promoting peace between former enemies. He met with American veterans, including some he had attacked at Pearl Harbor, in gestures of reconciliation. Commander Minoru Genda, the attack's principal tactical planner, served in Japan's post-war self-defense force and became a member of Japan's parliament, advocating for strong Japanese-American alliance during the Cold War. The strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate military campaign. The attack brought America into World War II with total commitment, ensuring Germany's defeat in Europe as well as Japan's defeat in the Pacific. Adolf Hitler's decision to declare war on America 4 days after Pearl Harbor, a decision he was not obligated by treaty to make, proved among his greatest strategic blunders. It united American efforts against both Axis powers and ensured America's full industrial capacity supported both European and Pacific theaters. The war that Pearl Harbor initiated transformed America into a global superpower. Before December 1941, the United States maintained a modest military and avoided foreign entanglements. After Pearl Harbor, America built the world's most powerful armed forces, established bases worldwide, and accepted responsibilities for global security that continue into the 21st century. The Pearl Harbor attack fundamentally altered America's relationship with the world, ending forever the nation's traditional isolationism. For the generation that fought World War II, Tom Brokaw's greatest generation, Pearl Harbor represented a defining moment that shaped their entire lives. The attack unified the nation behind total war effort, mobilizing society to unprecedented degree. Women entered the workforce in millions. Racial barriers began breaking down, though slowly, as military necessity demanded utilizing all citizens. The war accelerated social changes that might otherwise have required decades. The civil rights movement that gained momentum in the 1950s and 60s traced some origins to the contradictions highlighted by World War II, fighting tyranny abroad while maintaining segregation at home. Economic consequences proved equally dramatic. The war spending that Pearl Harbor initiated ended the Great Depression definitively. Unemployment disappeared as factories worked triple shifts producing war materials. The federal government's economic role expanded enormously, a shift that persisted after the war. American industrial capacity, fully mobilized, produced an avalanche of weapons that overwhelmed enemies. By war's end, American shipyards had built more tonnage than all other nations combined. Aircraft factories produced 300,000 planes. This productive capacity, undamaged by enemy bombing unlike European and Japanese industries, positioned America for post-war economic dominance. Today, more than 8 decades after the attack, Pearl Harbor retains powerful resonance in American consciousness. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," echoed through World War II as a rallying cry. Subsequent generations have used Pearl Harbor as a reference point for understanding national trauma. The Kennedy assassination, the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, and other shocking events are frequently compared to Pearl Harbor and their psychological impact. The attack established a template for understanding surprise attacks and their consequences. The last survivors of Pearl Harbor are now passing from life, taking their first-hand memories with them. As of 2025, fewer than a dozen identified Pearl Harbor survivors remain alive, all over 100 years old. Their passing closes a direct link to that December morning when the world changed. Yet the lessons of Pearl Harbor, about vigilance, preparedness, resilience, and the unpredictable nature of warfare, remain relevant. The attack demonstrated how quickly peace can shatter, how devastating surprise attacks can be, and how nations respond to existential threats.